Hunka burning video card? Hunka burning video card love? I don't know. It's probably a little too obscure. This is the Sapphire Radeon RX Vega 64 Nitro Plus limited edition. Limited because, good Lord, this thing has a lot of resources that goes into it. Yeah. I don't know. Vega 64. Vega 64 is sort of a curious product from AMD. I think most people would agree. I'm not sure that the Vega 64 and 56 lived up to the expectations, but the pricing right now is sort of really crazy for both memory and graphics cards. Well, whether you're team green or team red, I'm kind of at a loss. I'm not sure that right now is a great time to build a machine. If you can get a deal or if you can get something close to retail, I think retail on this is something like $679, or MSRP on this is something like $679. But I have had some bots watching Amazon, and it's been really tough, but not impossible, to grab video cards from Amazon. I haven't seen really any of the Nitro Plus limited edition, which is too bad because it actually works pretty well. Let's take a look. So before we even get to the graphics card, a retention bracket is included in the box. How cool is that? Sapphire knows this card is a hunka burning video card. So yeah, you get the bracket, and the bracket works pretty well. You just mount it to the side of your case. You adjust the little rubber stopper so it's not hitting a fan, and you get vibration dampening, you get some extra support. Good job, Sapphire. I mean, this is a premium card, premium features. It's nice. Wow. Look at that thing. That is completely nuts. It's just like 17 pounds of video card. It is, of course, a 2.5 slot card. It's a behemoth. There are 6 heat pipes, 3 fans, 2 of which are 92 millimeter, and a slightly smaller fan in the middle. And the VRM has its own heat pipe solution as well, because this thing has 3 4-pin PCI Express power inputs. You know what I'm noticing that's not in the box? A driver CD, which is great, because even giving somebody the CD, because the AMD Radeon graphics package moves so quickly, I think it's probably a bad move to give anybody any kind of drivers, because they will undoubtedly use whatever's on the CD, and that will end badly, because things have moved so quickly with, not just Vega, I mean, even things like Raven Ridge, the Ryzen CPUs. I mean, AMD is moving at a mile a minute. Also included in the box are some knickknacks about registering for a warranty, quick installation guide, the retention bracket installation guide, and a note that the video card actually has 2 4-pin fan headers. So the graphics card can control your case fans for more airflow. So for like a rear exhaust fan or a front intake fan, this could control those fans, and if the graphics card is heating up, then it will increase your air intake or whatever in your case if those case fans are plugged into the graphics card. You got to really think about it though. This card could dump upwards of 400 watts of heat into your case. That is a substantial amount of heat that you will have to deal with. So plan accordingly. The heat output of this graphics card means that you're going to need a significant power supply. So for our test system, a Threadripper 1950X, I'm using a Corsair RM850. And that's pretty much the minimum that I would recommend. This is a secondary graphics card because I'm using VFIO. I have a Radeon WX7100 as the primary card that's going to use a maximum of 150 watts. My CPU has been tuned, so that's going to be a maximum of 250 watts. And I'm really not going to push the overclocks on this graphics card. Fortunately, it's got an A and a B BIOS switch, and so I'm going to be running the more conservative BIOS. So I can expect this graphics card to consume probably around 300 watts. So 300, maybe 350. So let's say 350 watts, 450, 475, 5, 6, 775. That should be enough wattage left over for the other components that are going to be in the system. But you know, basically we're already at the limits of this 850 watt power supply pretty much. Now this is an exciting product from Sapphire for 2 reasons. One, the return of the vapor chamber. I mean, I talk about it like that. It's, you know, the vapor chamber has disappeared and it's coming back. And that's not really the case. Vapor chamber has kind of already always been there. If the product needs vapor chamber, they will give it vapor chamber. But if the product doesn't need vapor chamber, they don't give it vapor chamber because it's an extra expense for everybody else. Why would you have vapor chamber? This has vapor chamber because, good Lord, Vega 64 dumps an insane amount of heat. So, in terms of specs, 8 gigabytes of HBM2 running at 945 megahertz, pretty snazzy. 1611 megahertz on the boost clock. Yes, 1611. And you can actually push it a little bit further than this. I mean, you can open it up, and of course, power utilization and that sort of thing is a thing. But you can also underclock these. I mean, there's not a lot of people that talk about the Vega underclocking. And you can underclock this. You can just set the power target to be a little bit less and dramatically reduce the power usage of these cards without really sacrificing a lot in terms of performance. So, I mean, of course, the miners are going to do that. If you're buying a card for mining, you just reduce the power target by 25% and you're good to go. In terms of like, okay, summarize the benchmarks for me. What's the bottom line? This card performs very, very close to the liquid edition Vega 64. So the Vega 64 that has the built-in AIO cooler and the blower cooler for everything else. It's not quite as fast, but it is almost as fast. It's very, very close. There were some anomalies, like I was trying to compare my benchmark results with other benchmark results on the internet because this is obviously not a launch day review. And I think that the adrenaline drivers have improved somewhat because there were a few anomalies in my own benchmarks where it's like, that seems interesting. Now, to be sure, in terms of like competition with Team Green, this is not as fast as a 1080 Ti, but it is faster than a 1080, especially with the adrenaline drivers in a lot of scenarios now, especially with the overclock and especially with like the default more aggressive BIOS, that primary BIOS where it runs at, like it's just using crazy amounts of power. It is going to be substantially faster than a 1080, but not quite as fast as a 1080 Ti. And there is a lot of variability between games, which is going to owe to optimization for specific games. You want to turn, NVIDIA GameWorks off in your game, obviously, stuff like that. In terms of physical connectors at the back, we've got 2 DisplayPort and 2 HDMI. So that's a pretty good setup if you're into VR. This does have the Liquid VR technology from AMD. Also has X-Connect, so if you wanted to run this in a Thunderbolt enclosure, you totally could. Although I think that PCI Express by 4 connection from Thunderbolt is going to hamstring you a little bit on a card like this. You might take a look at the Sapphire, Vega 56 cards instead. The reference cards, Vega 64 and Vega 56, are pretty much unavailable at this point, owing to the fact that AMD is shipping almost all of their Vega GPUs to Apple and companies like Sapphire to build their own aftermarket cards. And the MSRP of this card at $679 is not a terrible deal considering the landscape of every other price. I mean, Pepperidge Farm remembers when the 1080 Ti was, but it's just not that way anymore. Prices have increased. HBM2 memory is fantastically expensive. So it's a really weird landscape right now for buying graphics cards. In terms of, does this card deliver on its promises for Vega 64? Yes, it does. In terms of, is this card good for things like open source scenarios where, let's say that you want to use kernel 4.15 with the new open source AMD GPU, does it deliver? Yes, it does. AMD GPU on this card is super nice. It works really, really well. I'm very, very happy with that. In terms of RGB bling and that sort of thing, I like the aesthetic of this card. It's got RGB, it's kind of subdued, it's not garish in my opinion. It works pretty well if you're into that kind of thing. If you're gonna mount the GPU vertically and show it off, you can. The shroud looks pretty good. It is a 2.5 slot card, so when you're building your system, picking out your motherboard, bear that in mind because a motherboard that's designed for a 2-slot graphics card is probably not gonna work out for you. Or a case, depending on whatever it is that you're building. But this card is a substantial card. This is also the card that we're using with Looking Glass. So if you're into running a Linux host with a Windows gaming virtual machine, Looking Glass, this is one of the cards that we're using for testing. So huge thanks to Sapphire for helping us make that project happen, giving us the hardware that we need for testing and solving some issues and things like that. And if you're not familiar with that project, what it is you run Windows under Linux, and normally you would have to have a monitor hooked up to this graphics card. You would share this graphics card with a virtual machine. And so the computer is virtual, but the graphics card is real. and you would have a monitor hooked up to this graphics card, and that's where your games would display. Well, Looking Glass is a piece of software that will copy the frame buffer from the graphics card that's in the guest to the graphics card in the host. And this is a surprisingly inexpensive operation. It really works great for 1080p and 1440p. There are some memory bandwidth issues that can make high FPS gaming at 4K a little more problematic, but it's still really playable. It's actually buttery smooth for 1080p and 1440p. We're still working on the 4K side of things, but if you want to do that without having to have an external monitor for your Windows virtual machine, you can totally do that, and that's really exciting. And I've talked too much about that because most people don't care about that in a graphics card review. It's just like, is this card worth the premium? And over MSRP of a Vega 64, yes, it absolutely is. It is mind-blowing how like Sapphire knows what they're doing with AMD products. Let's just be honest with ourselves. They know what they're doing. They didn't skimp on this card at all. They didn't really do anything wrong. They are giving Vega 64 the best possible shot that you possibly can give Vega 64, and this is it. So if you pick up one of these and you want to share your experiences, especially if you pick up one of these for Linux and you want to share your experiences, kernel 4.15 and later, we're not really interested in that old stuff, then please do come over to the forums at Level 1 Techs. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.